Have you ever wondered how one act of kindness could change a life forever? What would you do if a freezing golden retriever and her fragile puppy showed up at your door on a stormy night? Could you be the one to give them hope? And what if, through saving them, you discovered a new purpose in your own life? The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a biting chill that seeped into every crevice of the world outside. Inside his small cabin, tucked away in the woods, Ethan Brooks sat at his desk, the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminating stacks of papers and an open notebook. As a writer, solitude had become his companion. Since the loss of his wife 2 years earlier, the quiet of the forest had offered him a strange comfort, a place to think, reflect, and put his thoughts to paper. Ethan had been working on a manuscript for weeks, one he hoped would finally break through the creative fog that had settled over his life. The sound of his pen scratching against paper filled the cabin, blending with the crackle of the fireplace. He paused, staring at the page before him. Words came slowly these days, often feeling hollow. He tapped the pen against his temple, searching for inspiration. Then, faintly at first, he heard it, a scratching sound at the door. Ethan froze, his pen suspended mid-air. For a moment, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, rattling the wooden cabin's shutters. But then it came again, persistent and deliberate. Frowning, Ethan pushed back his chair and stood. He grabbed his sweater from the back of the chair, draping it over his shoulders as he moved toward the door. The air outside would be unforgiving, and he braced himself as he turned the knob. The cold hit him like a wall. Snow swirled around the porch, and the ground was covered in a thick, untouched blanket of white. Standing in the middle of it all was a dog, a golden retriever, trembling uncontrollably. Her coat was matted with ice, her breath visible in short, ragged puffs. Beside her lay a tiny puppy, barely moving, its small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The mother dog lifted her head and locked eyes with him. They were a deep, sorrowful brown, filled with a pleading desperation that words could never capture. "Hey there," Ethan said softly, crouching to meet her gaze. He extended a hand cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "It's okay, you're safe." The dog didn't move, but her eyes never left his. Ethan noticed the way her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from sheer exhaustion. His gaze dropped to her leg, where a gash ran deep, blood staining the fur around it. Without hesitation, Ethan scooped up the puppy, cradling its frail body in his arms. "Come on," he urged gently, motioning for the mother to follow him. She hesitated, her legs wobbling as she stood, but she took a shaky step forward, then another, until she crossed the threshold into the warmth of the cabin. Ethan closed the door against the storm, shutting out the howl of the wind. The sudden warmth of the room caused the mother dog to shudder, her body beginning to thaw as she stood protectively near her pup. Ethan laid the puppy on a soft blanket near the fireplace and quickly grabbed another towel to wrap around the mother. "You've had a rough night, haven't you?" Ethan murmured, his voice gentle. He worked carefully, drying her fur and avoiding the wound on her leg. The puppy let out a faint whimper, the first sound it had made since arriving, and Ethan felt a flicker of hope. He turned his attention to the puppy, its tiny frame unnervingly still. Ethan rubbed its body gently with a warm towel, trying to generate some heat. "Hang in there, little one," he whispered. The mother dog, whom Ethan decided to call Snow, watched him intently, her amber eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust. Ethan moved quickly to assess Snow's condition. The gash on her leg looked deep, but not fresh. She was malnourished, her ribs visible beneath her golden coat, and her paws were raw from walking through the ice. He cleaned her wound as best he could, applying antiseptic from his first aid kit. Snow flinched but didn't pull away, her eyes never leaving Ethan. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Ethan said, his voice tinged with sympathy. "But you're safe now." Once Snow and the puppy seemed stable, Ethan grabbed his journal from the desk. The night's events felt too significant not to record. He began to write, noting Snow's condition and the puppy's fragile state. The scratches of his pen filled the room once again, a stark contrast to the silence outside. The fire crackled softly as Ethan set down his pen and returned to the pair. Snow had curled up beside her pup, her nose nudging it gently. Ethan knelt beside them, his heart aching at the sight. He placed a small bowl of water and some leftover chicken near Snow, hoping she'd eat. She sniffed it cautiously before taking a few tentative bites. "That's it," Ethan said with a small smile. "You've got to keep your strength up." The puppy stirred slightly, letting out another faint whimper. Snow immediately nuzzled it, licking its tiny head. Ethan watched in quiet awe. The bond between them was unbreakable, even in the face of such hardship. It was clear that Snow had braved the storm to save her pup, doing whatever it took to keep it alive. Ethan's thoughts drifted as he sat beside the fire. He couldn't shake the image of Snow standing on his porch, her eyes filled with a silent plea. She hadn't knocked on just any door. She had found his. It felt almost intentional, as if she knew he wouldn't turn them away. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the weight of that realization. As the night stretched on, Ethan kept a watchful eye on Snow and Hope. The puppy's breaths were shallow but steady, and Snow seemed to relax for the first time, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion. Ethan added another log to the fire, the warm glow casting flickering shadows across the room. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose, a need to protect and nurture. He didn't know what Snow and Hope's story was, but he knew they had become part of his own. Before turning in for the night, Ethan wrote one final note in his journal. "Sometimes it's not the words we write that matter, but the actions we take. Tonight, the story found me. 2 lives, trembling in the snow, and a chance to give them hope." With that, Ethan closed the journal, looked at the pair sleeping peacefully by the fire, and whispered, "You're safe now." The blizzard outside showed no signs of easing. The wind battered against the cabin's wooden walls, and snow piled high against the windows, cocooning Ethan, Snow, and Hope inside. The warmth of the fireplace created a stark contrast to the relentless storm outside, but Ethan felt the weight of the situation. Hope lay wrapped in a thick towel near the fire, his tiny chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms. Snow sat close, her body partially shielding him, her amber eyes darting between Ethan and the door. She was alert, her ears twitching at every sound the storm carried. Her tension was palpable. Ethan knelt by Hope, checking the puppy's condition. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he whispered, gently stroking the small bundle of fur. The puppy stirred weakly at his touch, its soft whimper barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Ethan grabbed a small dropper, filled it with warm water, and carefully coaxed Hope to drink. "You've got to stay with us, little guy," Ethan murmured. Hope swallowed a few drops, his movements sluggish but deliberate. Encouraged, Ethan repeated the process, speaking to the puppy in soothing tones. Snow, however, wasn't as relaxed. Every time Ethan moved closer to Hope, she let out a low growl, her body stiffening as her gaze locked onto him. Ethan paused, his hands raised in a gesture of reassurance. "It's okay, Snow," he said softly. "I'm just trying to help." She didn't back away but remained tense, her protectiveness evident. Ethan understood. She had been through too much to trust easily. Her growls weren't threatening but cautious, a mother's instinct to defend her vulnerable pup. Ethan retreated a step and sat cross-legged on the floor, giving her space. He watched as Snow leaned down, licking Hope's head gently, her nose nudging him closer to her body. The connection between them was unbreakable, forged through shared survival. "You're a good mom," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've kept him alive through all this. That's something incredible." Snow's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but she didn't look at him. Ethan took the moment to observe her more closely, noting the way her body positioned itself as a barrier between him and her pup. Her wound, though cleaned and bandaged, seemed to ache with each movement, but she didn't let it stop her. She was focused entirely on Hope. Ethan returned to his desk, grabbing his journal and pen. Snow fascinated him, not just as a creature of instinct, but as a character. There was something in her eyes, intelligence, resolve, and a story that he couldn't yet grasp. She wasn't just any dog. She had lived through something extraordinary, and it showed in the way she moved and the way she guarded her pup with unrelenting determination. As he began to write, his mind raced with possibilities. Could Snow have been abandoned? Was she running from danger? The questions were endless, and each one made her story more compelling. Ethan jotted down notes describing her posture, her cautious growls, and the way her gaze carried both fear and resilience. He paused to sketch the moment. Snow lying protectively over Hope near the fire, her body forming a circle of safety. It was the kind of imagery that would captivate readers, a symbol of love and survival. Hours passed, and the storm continued to rage. Ethan kept his distance, allowing Snow and Hope to rest while he busied himself preparing a small meal. He warmed up chicken and rice, mashing it into soft portions before placing it in a bowl near Snow. She sniffed the food cautiously, her amber eyes flicking to Ethan as if assessing his intentions. "It's for you," Ethan said, staying seated to avoid intimidating her. "You've earned it." Snow hesitated for a moment longer before lowering her head to eat. She took slow, deliberate bites, her body still angled protectively over Hope. Ethan couldn't help but smile. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. After eating, Snow seemed to relax slightly, though her guard was far from down. She lay down fully beside Hope, her head resting on her paws. Her eyes, half-lidded but alert, never strayed far from Ethan. As the night wore on, Ethan returned to the fire, sitting a few feet away from the pair. He watched the flames dance, his thoughts drifting to the book he'd been struggling to write. For weeks, he had been searching for a story, something meaningful, something real. And now, it seemed, the story had found him. Snow and Hope weren't just animals to him anymore. They were symbols of survival, resilience, and the power of connection. The parallels to his own life were undeniable. He, too, had been searching for hope in the midst of his own storm, and now it lay before him in the form of a trembling golden retriever and her fragile pup. In the quiet moments of the night, Ethan picked up his notebook and began to write again. This time, the words came easily, flowing from his pen like the crackling of the fire. He described Snow's every movement, her strength in the face of adversity, and the unspoken bond that was slowly forming between them. When he looked up, he noticed Snow watching him. Her eyes weren't as wary as before. Instead, they held a glimmer of curiosity, as if she were beginning to understand that he meant no harm. Ethan smiled softly and nodded, whispering, "We'll get through this together." By the time the first light of dawn crept through the frosted windows, the storm had begun to subside. Snow stirred, lifting her head to check on Hope, who let out a faint whimper before settling again. Ethan felt a sense of relief as he watched them. The worst of the night was over, but the journey ahead was far from finished. Ethan closed his journal, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Snow and Hope had brought something into his life that he hadn't realized he was missing: purpose. And in return, he would give them what they needed most: safety, warmth, and a chance to heal. "Welcome to the family," Ethan whispered as he stoked the fire, ready to face whatever challenges the next day might bring. The storm that had raged through the night had finally relented, leaving behind a blanket of pristine white snow that glistened under the weak morning light filtering through the windows. Ethan stretched as he rose from his chair, the warmth of the fire now a faint ember in the hearth. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional soft whimpers of Hope nestled beside Snow. Ethan moved carefully, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the room. Hope stirred slightly, his tiny paws twitching in a dream. Snow, ever watchful, opened her amber eyes as Ethan approached, her ears perking up. There was still a guardedness in her gaze, but it had softened compared to the night before. "Good morning, Snow," Ethan said softly, crouching a few feet away. "How's our little fighter doing?" Hope let out a faint whimper, but remained curled up against his mother's warm coat. Snow gave him a gentle nudge with her nose, a quiet reassurance that everything was all right. Ethan smiled, marveling at the bond between them. As the day progressed, Ethan began to notice subtle things about Snow. Her movements were deliberate, almost calculated, as though she had been trained. When Ethan picked up the empty bowl from the night before, Snow immediately straightened, her posture alert as she observed his actions. Her ears flicked in his direction, and she seemed to study him, not just with curiosity but with intelligence. It wasn't just her attentiveness. Snow's reaction to certain noises, a creak in the floorboards or the opening of a drawer, was sharp, her head snapping toward the sound. She moved with a precision Ethan had rarely seen in dogs, her steps purposeful and fluid. "Who are you, Snow?" Ethan muttered under his breath, watching her as she paced the room. She was more than just a lost dog. There was a story behind her eyes, one that Ethan was determined to uncover. Hope, meanwhile, was slowly regaining his strength. Though still weak, he managed to lift his head when Ethan approached with the dropper of warm water. The puppy's tiny licks were tentative but steady, and his breathing had become less labored. Ethan noticed, however, that Hope often twitched in his sleep, his body jerking as though reliving a nightmare. That night, as the cabin grew quiet, Hope startled awake with a sharp yelp, his small body trembling. Snow was instantly at his side, licking his head and nuzzling him close. Ethan sat nearby, his heart aching at the sight. "What happened to you two out there?" Ethan wondered aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Snow's eyes met his, and for a brief moment it felt as though she understood the question. The next morning, Ethan decided to give Snow a proper checkup. He gently examined her wound, which was healing well thanks to his care. As he ran his fingers through her thick golden coat, he felt something unusual, a small hard bump just under the skin near the back of her neck. "What's this?" Ethan murmured, parting the fur to get a closer look. It was a microchip. Ethan sat back, a mix of surprise and curiosity washing over him. Microchips were common in pets, but something about this felt different. The precision of its placement and Snow's behavior hinted at a past far more complex than that of an ordinary family pet. "You've got secrets, don't you, Snow?" Ethan said softly, his fingers brushing over the spot. Snow didn't flinch or move away, as though she trusted him enough to handle this discovery. Ethan knew he couldn't access the chip's information without a scanner, but the revelation set his mind racing. Who had owned Snow before? Was she part of a rescue organization or a more specialized program? And why had she ended up alone in the middle of a storm, fighting to keep Hope alive? Ethan returned to his desk, pulling out his journal and jotting down everything he had observed. Snow's alertness, her trained movements, the microchip. It all painted a picture of a dog with a significant history. Ethan felt a thrill he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, his mind overflowed with ideas, the pieces of a story forming as he wrote. He began to sketch out scenes, imagining Snow in various scenarios, a search and rescue mission, a training facility, or even escaping a dangerous situation to protect her pup. The possibilities were endless, and each one added depth to her character. As Ethan wrote, Snow lay near the fire, her eyes half closed but still watchful. Hope slept soundly beside her, his small body rising and falling in steady breaths. Ethan paused, glancing at them with a soft smile. "You're more than just characters," he said quietly. "You're the story I didn't know I needed." Later that afternoon, Ethan ventured outside to gather more firewood. The world was still, the air crisp and cold. Snow followed him to the door, her posture guarded as she scanned the tree line. Even here, in the safety of the cabin, she remained vigilant. "Stay here, Snow," Ethan said gently. "I'll be right back." Snow hesitated, her amber eyes following him as he stepped into the snow. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just watching him, she was protecting him. As he hauled the firewood back inside, Ethan noticed Snow's ears twitching, her body tense. She was reacting to sounds he couldn't hear, her instincts sharper than he had anticipated. Ethan set down the wood and watched her carefully. "You're not just any dog," he said, more to himself than to her. "You've been trained for something. But what?" That evening, as the fire crackled softly, Ethan sat with his notebook, fleshing out the beginnings of a story inspired by Snow. He wrote about her strength, her resilience, and the unspoken bond that had begun to form between them. The microchip was a mystery he couldn't solve yet, but it added an intriguing layer to her character. Snow watched him from her spot near the fire, her head resting on her paws. Her gaze was steady, as though she knew he was writing about her. Ethan chuckled softly. "You're going to be the star, Snow," he said, his pen pausing on the page. "You and Hope, both." The cabin grew quiet as night fell, the warmth of the fire enveloping them. Ethan closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, his eyes lingering on Snow and Hope. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Their story was just beginning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light through the melting snow that still blanketed the forest floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a serene stillness. Ethan decided it was the perfect time to give Snow some much-needed exercise and fresh air. Hope, still too fragile to venture outside, remained snug in his makeshift bed near the fire. Ethan clipped a makeshift leash to Snow's collar, a simple piece of rope he had fashioned earlier. Snow stood alert, her golden coat gleaming in the sunlight as they stepped onto the porch. Her amber eyes scanned the tree line, her ears perked. Ethan smiled at her intensity. "Don't worry," he said, patting her head. "We're just stretching our legs." The forest was quiet, save for the soft crunch of snow underfoot. Snow walked slightly ahead of Ethan, her posture both relaxed and attentive. It was clear she had been in the wilderness before. She moved with a familiarity and confidence that Ethan found intriguing. Every so often she would pause, her nose to the ground, sniffing for scents carried by the gentle breeze. Ethan couldn't help but admire her. "You've seen more of the world than I have, haven't you?" he mused aloud. Snow's ears twitched at his voice, but she continued forward, her steps light and purposeful. They wandered deeper into the forest, where the trees grew taller and the shadows longer. Ethan found himself taking mental notes, observing the way Snow moved and reacted to her surroundings. He jotted down quick phrases in his notebook whenever they stopped, ideas forming in his mind for a scene in his story. As they approached a clearing, Snow suddenly stopped. Her body stiffened, her ears pinned back. Ethan froze, following her gaze. A low growl rumbled in Snow's throat, her tail raised in warning. "Snow, what is it?" Ethan whispered, his eyes scanning the clearing. From the shadows emerged a dog, a lean, scruffy figure with a matted black and grey coat. Its ribs were visible beneath its fur, and its yellow eyes gleamed with a mix of desperation and caution. It stood several feet away, its posture low and hesitant. Ethan felt his heart rate quicken. He instinctively tightened his grip on Snow's leash, but she didn't move. Her growl deepened, her stance protective, as she positioned herself between Ethan and the stranger. "Easy, Snow," Ethan murmured. "Let's not scare him." The stray dog, which Ethan quickly decided to name Ash in his head, didn't approach. Instead, it remained still, its gaze fixed on Snow. There was something in the way Ash tilted his head, a flicker of recognition that Ethan couldn't ignore. Snow took a cautious step forward, her growl softening but her body still tense. Ash responded with a tentative wag of his tail, but his wary eyes betrayed his hunger and fear. Ethan watched the exchange in silence, unsure whether to intervene or let them communicate in their way. It was clear that Snow and Ash shared some sort of history. Snow's guarded reaction wasn't that of a stranger encountering a threat. It was more complex, as if she were unsure whether to trust the dog standing before her. "Do you know him?" Ethan asked quietly, though he knew Snow couldn't answer. Still, her body language seemed to speak volumes. Ash took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Snow didn't growl this time, but she didn't relax either. Ethan felt the tension in the air, the unspoken exchange between the two dogs, like a conversation he couldn't hear. Ethan slowly crouched, pulling a piece of jerky from his pocket. He had brought it along in case Snow needed a treat, but now it seemed like a peace offering for Ash. "Here, buddy," Ethan said, his voice calm and soothing. He tossed the jerky a few feet in front of Ash, careful not to startle him. The stray hesitated, sniffing the air before inching forward to snatch the treat. He retreated quickly, chewing with obvious desperation. Snow watched him closely, her tail lowering slightly as her posture softened. Ethan could sense her internal struggle. She was protective of Ethan, but not entirely hostile toward Ash. "You've been through a lot too, haven't you?" Ethan said, addressing Ash. "I wonder how you two know each other." As Ash finished the treat, he took a few more cautious steps forward, his yellow eyes darting between Ethan and Snow. Snow remained still, her gaze locked on Ash as though she were weighing a decision. Finally, she let out a soft huff and lowered her head slightly, a gesture that seemed to signal acceptance. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Well, that's progress," he muttered, glancing at his notebook. The scene unfolding before him was something he couldn't have scripted if he tried. The dynamic between Snow and Ash was layered, filled with tension, recognition, and unspoken history. He quickly jotted down notes, ideas forming for a pivotal moment in his book. Perhaps his protagonist would face a similar encounter, a reunion fraught with questions and unresolved emotions. Ethan felt a thrill of inspiration, the kind he hadn't experienced in years. After a few more moments of silent observation, Ash turned and retreated into the shadows. Snow watched him go, her ears twitching as the sound of his footsteps faded. She stood still for a long moment before glancing back at Ethan. "Well," Ethan said with a faint smile, "I guess he's not a threat." Snow huffed softly, as if agreeing, and resumed walking. Ethan followed, his mind racing with possibilities. What was the story between Snow and Ash? Had they been companions once, or had their paths crossed under different circumstances? The encounter only deepened the mystery surrounding Snow's past. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the snow-covered landscape. Ethan unclipped the leash and patted Snow's head. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" he said. Snow wagged her tail faintly before heading straight to where Hope lay sleeping, her maternal instincts kicking in once more. Ethan sat at his desk, flipping open his notebook. He began to write, furiously, capturing every detail of the encounter with Ash. The tension, the silent exchange, the questions it raised, all of it would become the foundation for a pivotal scene in his book. As the fire crackled softly, Ethan glanced at Snow, who had curled up beside Hope, her eyes half closed but alert. She was a dog of secrets, and Ethan knew he had only scratched the surface. But for now, they were safe, and the story was beginning to take shape. The morning sunlight spilled through the cabin's windows, warming the wooden floors as Ethan prepared for the day ahead. Snow watched him carefully from her spot near the fireplace, her amber eyes filled with quiet curiosity. Hope lay beside her, his tiny body rising and falling in steady breaths, recovering more with each passing day. Ethan knelt down and patted Snow's head. "Today's the day we figure out a bit more about you," he said softly. Snow tilted her head, her ears twitching at the sound of his voice. He grabbed his jacket, a small bag packed with essentials, and Snow's makeshift leash. After ensuring Hope was comfortably settled, Ethan opened the door, letting the crisp morning air wash over them. Snow stepped outside hesitantly, but followed closely as Ethan guided her to the truck parked in the clearing. The drive to the nearest veterinary clinic took over an hour, the winding roads lined with snow-covered trees. Snow sat quietly in the passenger seat, her posture relaxed, but her gaze watchful. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than just a lost dog. Her behavior, her instincts, it all pointed to a past far more complex than he could imagine. As they arrived, the clinic came into view, a modest building with a bright red door that stood out against the snowy landscape. Ethan parked the truck and glanced at Snow. "Let's see what we can find out." Inside the clinic, the warmth was immediate, the scent of antiseptic mingling with the faint sounds of animals. The receptionist greeted Ethan with a kind smile, her eyes drifting to Snow. "What a beautiful dog," she said. "What brings you in today?" Ethan explained about the microchip he had discovered and how Snow had shown up on his doorstep during the storm. The receptionist nodded sympathetically and called for the veterinarian. Dr. Maddox, a middle-aged man with a reassuring demeanor, soon appeared. "Let's take a look," he said, kneeling down to examine Snow. She stood still, her amber eyes locked onto Ethan as if seeking reassurance. After a thorough checkup, Dr. Maddox took out a handheld scanner. "Let's see what this chip tells us." The scanner beeped, and a string of numbers appeared on the screen. Dr. Maddox frowned slightly as he input the data into a computer. A moment later, his expression shifted to one of mild surprise. "Interesting," he said, turning to Ethan. "Snow isn't just any dog. She was registered to an organization that deals with wildlife conservation and protection. Specifically, they train animals like Snow for search and rescue missions and even wildlife protection programs." Ethan blinked, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "You mean she's been trained for, what, saving animals? Protecting endangered species?" Dr. Maddox nodded. "It seems so. These programs are quite selective. Dogs like Snow are highly valuable for their intelligence and training." Ethan looked at Snow, who sat calmly beside him, her posture dignified. It all made sense now, the precision of her movements, the way she reacted to sounds, her protectiveness over Hope. Snow wasn't just a stray, she was part of something bigger. As Ethan and Dr. Maddox continued discussing Snow's history, Ethan's mind raced with questions. How had she ended up abandoned in the middle of a storm? What had happened to her handlers? And why was she running? Dr. Maddox interrupted his thoughts. "I should also mention, dogs from these programs are often targets for poachers and illegal wildlife traffickers. Their skills make them incredibly valuable." The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He glanced at Snow, who now seemed more vulnerable than ever. "So you're saying she might be in danger?" Dr. Maddox nodded gravely. "It's possible. If someone knew what she was capable of, they might go to great lengths to find her." Ethan thanked Dr. Maddox and paid for the visit, his thoughts heavy as he led Snow back to the truck. As they drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Snow and Hope had found their way to him for a reason, and it wasn't just chance. Back at the cabin, Ethan settled Snow inside and began scribbling furiously in his notebook. The day's events were too significant not to document. He described the discovery of the microchip, the revelation of Snow's training, and the unsettling possibility that someone might be looking for her. "This feels like something out of a detective novel," Ethan muttered as he wrote. The parallels were uncanny. An enigmatic dog, a hidden past, and the looming threat of danger. It was almost too perfect, too suspenseful. But this wasn't fiction. Snow and Hope's lives were real, and they were now intertwined with his own. The thought filled Ethan with both determination and dread. That evening, as Ethan sat by the fire, the soft rumble of an engine reached his ears. He froze, his hand tightening around his pen. Snow's ears perked up immediately, and she stood, her body tense, as she moved toward the window. Ethan followed her gaze and saw the faint outline of a truck parked at the edge of his property. Its headlights were off, and the engine idled quietly. A surge of unease washed over him. He moved cautiously to the window, his breath fogging the glass as he peered out. The truck didn't move, but the presence of it felt ominous. "Who is that?" Ethan whispered, his mind racing. Snow let out a low growl, her amber eyes locked on the vehicle. After several tense minutes, the truck slowly turned and drove away, its tires crunching on the snowy road. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. The danger Dr. Maddox had warned about suddenly felt all too real. Ethan returned to his desk, staring at the pages of his notebook. The story he was writing was no longer just inspiration, it was a reflection of his reality. He couldn't ignore the parallels between Snow's life and the plot unfolding in his mind. "I didn't sign up for a thriller," Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. But there was no turning back now. Snow and Hope had come to him for a reason, and it was up to him to protect them. As the fire crackled softly, Ethan made a silent promise. No matter what lay ahead, he would keep Snow and Hope safe. They were more than just characters in a story, they were family. The night was eerily quiet. The cabin, bathed in the soft glow of the fireplace, felt like a cocoon of safety amidst the wilderness. Ethan sat at his desk, his notebook open, pen in hand. Snow lay by the fire, her eyes half closed, but her ears alert. Hope was nestled beside her, his small body rising and falling in peaceful slumber. Ethan paused, tapping his pen against the page. He had been writing about Snow's strength and resilience, drawing parallels to his own life. Yet, despite the calm, an unshakable feeling of unease crept over him. Then it came, a faint, rustling sound from outside. Ethan froze, his head snapping toward the window. Snow's ears perked up immediately, and she lifted her head, her body stiffening as her nose twitched. A low growl rumbled in her throat. "What is it?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Snow didn't look at him, her amber eyes fixed on the door. Ethan's heart began to race. He moved cautiously to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. In the dim moonlight, he could make out two figures moving through the snow, their silhouettes dark and purposeful. His stomach dropped. Someone was here. Ethan's mind raced as he stepped back from the window, his breath quickening. Snow rose to her feet, her body tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. Ethan grabbed the leash and crouched beside her. "Snow," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "We need to go. Now." Snow seemed to understand. Her gaze shifted to Hope, and she nudged him gently, waking him from his sleep. The puppy let out a soft whimper, but Snow remained calm, her instincts guiding her. Ethan grabbed a backpack he had prepared earlier, an emergency kit he always kept on hand. He stuffed it with essentials: food, water, a flashlight, and a thick blanket. Slinging it over his shoulder, he motioned for Snow to follow him to the back door. They slipped out into the cold night, the snow crunching softly beneath their feet. Ethan held Hope close, wrapped in the blanket to shield him from the chill. Snow led the way, her movements swift and deliberate. She moved with a sense of purpose, her nose to the ground as she navigated the forest. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his pulse pounding. The figures had reached the cabin, their shadows moving through the windows. He didn't stay long enough to see what they were doing. "Just keep moving," he muttered to himself, his breath visible in the icy air. Snow guided them deeper into the forest, her path winding through trees and over frozen streams. Ethan struggled to keep up, the weight of the backpack and hope in his arms making each step more difficult. But Snow never faltered. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. Finally, after what felt like hours, Snow stopped at the entrance to a small cave. It was hidden by dense underbrush, nearly invisible in the darkness. Snow turned to Ethan, her eyes meeting his with an urgency that needed no explanation. "This is it, isn't it?" Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Snow didn't move, her posture firm as she waited for him to enter. Ethan ducked inside, carefully cradling hope as he adjusted to the dim interior. The cave was small but dry, the ground covered in soft dirt and pine needles. Snow followed, her body blocking the entrance as she scanned the forest for any signs of pursuit. Ethan sat down, his back against the cool stone wall. He unwrapped Hope, checking to make sure the puppy was warm and safe. Snow settled beside him, her eyes still fixed on the entrance. "You've been here before, haven't you?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Snow didn't respond, of course, but her behavior spoke volumes. She had led them here for a reason. This was a place she knew, a place she trusted. Ethan's mind drifted as he looked around the cave. He imagined Snow huddled here with Hope during the storm, protecting him from the elements, just as she was doing now. The thought sent a pang of admiration through him. "You're not just a character in a story," he said softly, glancing at her. "You're leading me through this. You're teaching me how to fight, how to keep going." Snow's ears twitched at his voice, but she didn't look at him. Instead, she lay down, her body finally relaxing now that they were safe, for the moment. As the hours passed, Ethan's fear began to fade, replaced by exhaustion. He held Hope close, his eyes growing heavy despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. Snow remained vigilant, her gaze never straying from the cave's entrance. Ethan thought back to the figures at the cabin. Who were they? Were they connected to Snow's mysterious past? The microchip, the poachers Dr. Maddox had warned him about, it all felt too coincidental. He pulled out his notebook and began to write, his hand shaking slightly as he tried to capture the night's events. The tension, the flight through the forest, the sanctuary of the cave. It was the kind of drama that would captivate readers. But this wasn't fiction. This was his life now. Ethan paused, staring at the page. "I don't know how this ends," he muttered, "but I'm not letting anything happen to you two." As dawn approached, the forest began to stir. Snow finally allowed herself to rest, curling up beside Hope and closing her eyes. Ethan leaned back against the wall, his mind still racing with questions. This journey had become more than just a story. It was a test, a trial that was forcing him to confront his fears and push beyond his limits, and through it all, Snow was his guide, her strength and determination lighting the way. Ethan glanced at the pair beside him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We'll get through this," he whispered. "Together." With that, he let his eyes close, the first rays of sunlight filtering into the cave as the new day began. The morning sun broke through the dense forest, casting warm rays across the snowy ground. The tranquility of the scene was a stark contrast to the tension Ethan had felt just days before. Snow and Hope rested peacefully inside the cabin, their ordeal seemingly behind them for now, but Ethan knew they couldn't live in hiding forever. Sitting at his desk, Ethan turned on his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He had spent the past few days gathering information, and now it was time to act. A wildlife protection agency had been recommended by Dr. Maddox, and after a brief hesitation, Ethan typed out an email detailing everything. Snow's microchip, her potential connection to a conservation program, and the mysterious figures that had appeared outside his cabin. Ethan hit send, exhaling deeply as though releasing the weight he'd been carrying. "Let's hope this is the right step," he muttered, glancing at Snow, who lay near the fireplace. She lifted her head and met his gaze, her amber eyes filled with quiet trust. The response came quicker than Ethan had expected. A representative from the wildlife agency confirmed Snow's history. She had indeed been part of a program designed to train dogs for wildlife conservation and protection. Her skills were invaluable, and the agency expressed deep concern for her safety, offering to take her and Hope into their care. Ethan stared at the email for a long time. He had done what was right for Snow and Hope, but the thought of letting them go tugged at something deep inside him. They weren't just guests in his home. They had become family. Snow wandered over, resting her head on his knee. Ethan scratched behind her ears, his heart heavy with indecision. "What do you think, girl? Do you want to stay?" Her tail wagged slightly, as if she understood. Ethan chuckled softly. "Well, I guess that's an answer." The wildlife agency representatives arrived 2 days later. They were professional and compassionate, understanding Ethan's reluctance to part with Snow and Hope. They conducted a thorough checkup, ensuring both dogs were healthy and safe. After hours of discussion, they agreed that Snow and Hope could remain with Ethan under the condition that he keep them out of harm's way and report any suspicious activity. Ethan breathed a sigh of relief as the representatives left, their assurance lifting a burden from his shoulders. Snow and Hope were safe, and they weren't going anywhere. That evening, Ethan decided it was time to make things official. Sitting at his workbench, he carefully crafted 2 leather collars, each one personalized with a small metal tag. He engraved the names with precision: Snow Guardian and Hope Miracle. When he finished, Ethan called Snow and Hope over. Snow sat patiently as he fastened the collar around her neck, her tail wagging softly. Hope, still wobbly on his tiny legs, sniffed his collar curiously before Ethan secured it. "There you go," Ethan said, stepping back to admire his work. "Now you're officially part of the family." Days turned into weeks, and life at the cabin began to settle into a peaceful rhythm. Snow and Hope thrived under Ethan's care, their once fragile bodies growing strong and healthy. Snow's coat gleamed in the sunlight, and Hope's playful energy filled the cabin with a warmth Ethan hadn't felt in years. The journey they had shared inspired Ethan in ways he hadn't anticipated. His notebook, once filled with scattered thoughts and half-finished ideas, now held the foundation of a story that felt alive. Every moment with Snow and Hope, their resilience, their bond, their survival, became the heart of his writing. Ethan poured himself into the manuscript, each word a reflection of the life they had built together. The title came to him naturally: Second Chances. It was a story about survival, love, and the power of finding hope in the darkest moments. When the book was published months later, Ethan could hardly believe the response. Readers from all over the country reached out, sharing their own stories of rescue and connection. Second Chances became more than just a book. It became a movement, inspiring others to adopt, protect, and care for animals in need. Ethan was invited to speak at events, his once quiet life transformed by the spotlight. But no matter how far he traveled, he always returned to the cabin, where Snow and Hope waited for him, their presence a constant reminder of why he had started this journey. One crisp autumn evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Snow and Hope by his side. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Hope, now a lively and confident pup, chased leaves in the yard, while Snow rested her head on Ethan's knee, her eyes filled with contentment. Ethan looked out at the world before him, his heart full. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible," he said softly, stroking Snow's fur. "This isn't just a home, it's a second chance for all of us." Snow lifted her head slightly, her amber eyes locking with his as if to say she understood. Hope bounded over, flopping onto Ethan's lap with a happy yip. Ethan laughed, wrapping his arms around the pup and Snow, pulling them close. In that moment, surrounded by the family he never expected, Ethan knew he had found his purpose. Their story wasn't just one of survival. It was a testament to the transformative power of love, trust and second chances. The world outside Ethan's cabin had changed in ways he never imagined. The book, Second Chances, had turned into a phenomenon, spreading across the country like wildfire. Readers from all walks of life reached out, moved by the story of Snow and Hope. Ethan's quiet tale of resilience and love had become a beacon for those searching for inspiration and purpose. Letters poured in, stories of animals saved, lives transformed, and communities coming together. Shelters reported spikes in adoptions, rescue organizations saw increased donations, and conversations about wildlife protection grew louder. What had started as a deeply personal journey had become a movement. Ethan, however, remained humble. For him, the true success wasn't in the sales or accolades, but in the life he shared with Snow and Hope. Still, when the invitation came to speak at a national animal protection event, Ethan knew it was an opportunity he couldn't refuse. The day of the event arrived with clear skies and a crisp autumn breeze. Ethan stood backstage, adjusting the microphone clipped to his shirt. Snow sat calmly by his side, her golden coat gleaming under the lights, while Hope, now a sprightly young dog, wagged his tail excitedly at every sound. "You ready, girl?" Ethan asked Snow, kneeling to meet her gaze. She nuzzled his hand in response, her trust unwavering. A staff member peeked into the room. "Mr. Brooks, you're up next." Ethan took a deep breath and straightened his jacket. As he stepped onto the stage, the applause from the crowd filled the large auditorium. Snow and Hope followed at his heels, their presence eliciting audible gasps and smiles from the audience. The room quieted as Ethan began to speak. 2 years ago, I was a man who had lost his way. My life was quiet, isolated, and empty. Then, on a freezing winter night, everything changed. I opened my door to find a trembling golden retriever and her fragile puppy on my porch fighting to survive. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Snow and Hope came into my life when I needed them most, though I didn't realize it at the time. They taught me about courage, trust, and the incredible power of second chances, not just for them, but for me too. Ethan gestured towards Snow and Hope, who sat obediently by his side. The audience watched them intently, captivated by their calm demeanor and undeniable bond. "Snow is more than just a dog," Ethan continued. "She's a symbol of resilience, of love that perseveres even in the face of unimaginable hardship. And Hope, well, he's proof that no matter how small or fragile we feel, we all have the strength to keep going." Ethan recounted the harrowing night of the storm, the discovery of Snow's past, and their escape into the forest. He spoke of the moment he realized Snow wasn't just a stray, but a protector, a survivor, with a story worth telling. As he described crafting the collars engraved with their names, his voice wavered with emotion. "But this isn't just about Snow and Hope," Ethan said, his tone growing firm. "It's about every animal out there waiting for someone to open their door, to give them a chance to be loved and to love in return." The crowd erupted into applause, but Ethan raised a hand gently to quiet them. "Stories like Snow and Hope's are happening every day, and we all have the power to be part of them. Whether it's adopting a shelter pet, supporting wildlife conservation, or simply choosing compassion, every action counts." Ethan concluded his speech with a heartfelt plea. "If there's one thing Snow and Hope have taught me, it's that love and kindness can change the world, one life at a time. I ask all of you today, what will you do with your second chance to make a difference?" As he stepped back from the podium, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Ethan glanced at Snow and Hope, who seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Snow nudged Hope playfully, and the crowd laughed, their hearts warmed by the sight. After the event, Ethan and the dogs were swarmed by attendees eager to meet them. Children crouched to pet Hope, who wagged his tail enthusiastically, while others admired Snow's calm and regal presence. Ethan answered questions and signed books, his gratitude growing with every conversation. By the end of the evening, Ethan was exhausted but fulfilled. As they returned to their quiet cabin, he sat on the porch with Snow and Hope by his side, gazing at the star-filled sky. "You two are incredible," Ethan said, his voice soft. "You've changed more lives than we'll ever know." Snow rested her head on his knee, her eyes half closed in contentment. Hope curled up at Ethan's feet, letting out a happy sigh. In the months that followed, the momentum continued. Shelters and rescue organizations reported record-breaking support, inspired by Snow and Hope's story. Ethan's book, Second Chances, became a staple in schools, libraries, and community centers, its message resonating far beyond his expectations. But for Ethan, the greatest success was the life he now shared with Snow and Hope, a life filled with purpose, connection, and love. As he worked on his next book, he knew one thing for certain: their story was far from over.